Quilt patterns are one of our most important tools as quilt makers, and they include so much information, incredible geometry, and lots of directions for us to know how to take that picture on the front cover and turn it into a real quilt. My name is Holly, a Knight of String and Story, and it's my job to guide you to quilt with confidence. And today I want to talk about how to read quilt patterns. Yes, they contain lots and lots of useful information, but it's only going to help us if we understand how to read the different parts of a pattern. Let's get started. Here you can see the front cover of my Sawtooth Star quilt pattern. This is a free pattern that is available on our website, and I would love to send it directly to your inbox. Today we're going to go through it together so you understand the different parts, and you can find a link down in the caption of this video in order to get your very own copy with all of the details and information included. All right? Now, here on the front cover, you're going to see a couple of important parts. Obviously, right at the top, we're going to see the title of the quilt pattern. Then we're going to be captured, hopefully, in a very good way, by the large image of the quilt itself. It is standard practice to use either a diagram or graphic like we've done here, or a photo of the quilt for this front portion. My only thought is that I think it is best when designers use an actual flat image here on the front of the pattern. I think it makes it easier for you as the quilter to really envision what this pattern is going to look like. Other key features here on the front of the pattern are going to include the different sizes that you can make. For the Sawtooth Star, you can make the pillow, the throw, or the bed size. And then down at the bottom, there's just a little bit more information about me as the designer. Now, the other part of this quilt pattern that you will likely be able to see prior to purchase is going to be the back of the pattern. You'll notice already that there is a chart in the middle of the back. Charts play a big role in quilt patterns because we can include a lot of information in a much more concise space. Key features of the back of a quilt pattern are, of course, going to once again include the title of the pattern. If there was one image of the quilt on the front, there's usually a different image on the back. Sometimes it's a different choice of fabrics, a different colorway, or maybe a more stylized image of the quilt. And a little bit more information, again, about where to find me as the designer. The back of the quilt's pattern is usually dominated by that chart that I already mentioned. This chart tells you how much fabric you need in order to make the different sizes of the quilt. Typically, the fabrics go down the left-hand side of that chart. It may be named the way that I've done here. The Sawtooth Star quilt pattern is only a 2-fabric pattern. So you need fabric for the stars and you need fabric for the background. So I simply named these fabrics on my chart. If I were to be showing you the back of the Star Island quilt pattern, which is this pattern behind me, there are 5 colors. So down the side, it's simply going to say color 1, color 2, etc., with a little key as to where in the quilt each color is going to land. Then at the very bottom of that chart, there's usually going to be included a section for how much backing you need. That is the literal back of your quilt, right? And how much binding, which is that fabric that goes along the edge. Most quilt patterns are only going to give you directions for how to assemble the quilt top, but we include the backing and the binding to make it as easy as possible for you to get all the fabric you need to take that quilt to completion. Now, across the top of this chart, you're going to see the different sizes once again. There are some generic terms that get used in quilt patterns, things like pillow, throw, bed-sized, but none of those have specific measurements necessarily attached to them. There's a wide range of what would be considered acceptable in all of those categories. So you will likely also see in parentheses, like I've done here, the actual dimensions of that quilt and possibly the number of blocks that are going to be included in that size of quilt. Next, let's go and look at the inside of the quilt pattern. Here on the inside of the quilt pattern, we're going to start out with, again, a little bit more information about the pattern, a picture of me as the designer. This is pretty common. And then there's going to be some important notes. If I zoom in here, you'll see these are standard for most quilt patterns, things like seam allowances, a direction to read all the way through before you get started, information about where to go if you think there may be updates or corrections to the pattern that you want to make sure that you have. And a reminder that this pattern is for personal use only, should not be duplicated, distributed, etc. Now on this page, we also included a repeat of those fabric requirements that were on the back of the quilt pattern. Now, this doesn't always work layout wise to repeat this information, but because we had the space, we decided it would be really useful so that you can see those fabric requirements opposite the beginning of the cutting instructions. After you get through the introductory information of a quilt pattern, which usually only takes up one page, you're going to dive straight into cutting instructions. Now, when we get to the section for cutting out a quilt, there are 3 things that you may see. You may see one of them, you may see all of them. It just depends pattern to pattern. But that's going to include graphs for how many different shapes and sizes you need from your different fabrics laid out in chart form. You may see diagrams as to how to cut out specific shapes from a certain piece of fabric. And you may also see written instructions. Here in the sawtooth star pattern, I've included 2 of those. The sawtooth star pattern is written so that you can use yardage or you can use fat quarters, which are a form of pre-cut. And how you approach your cutting will be different depending on whether or not you're using fat quarters or yardage. So here at the top of the page, you can see I've kind of grayed out the details here. As a reminder, this is a free pattern. Hit that link down in the caption of this video and you can download this pattern for free with all of this information visible. But here in this big kind of gray rectangle, if you were cutting from fat quarters, this has an actual cutting diagram of how you would chop it up to have all the pieces that you need to make 2 blocks from those 2 fat quarters. Just underneath begins the instructions for cutting out yardage. Now, for a long time, it was very standard that there would be one cutting chart, and down the side would be the different colors, and across the top would be the size that you need to cut out of your fabric. And there was no indication as far as that intermediate step of going from yardage to strips to squares and rectangles and triangles, etc. Now it is very common for quilt pattern designers to split those steps into 2, just like I've done here. So this first chart is labeled cutting yardage. And you can see we only have 2 fabrics, so I've put those down on the left-hand side. And then across the top, I've put the different strip widths that need to be cut. You'll see here that it says 4 inches by WOF strip. That's width of fabric or selvage to selvage. So when fabric is rolled off the bolt, usually you unroll it to the right. That fold is closest to your tummy down at the bottom, and there's those fuzzy selvage ends up at the top. And we slice away from us from fold to selvage, and that is width of fabric. It is usually 40 to 42 inches, depending on the fabric manufacturer. So you can see here that we're going to need to cut some 4-inch strips out of our yardage for our star fabrics, but we will not need to cut any 4-inch strips out of the background. This number here in the intersection of the column and the row tells us how many strips to cut. The first number is for the smallest size. Then you have those opening parentheses, and the numbers separated by commas progress through the rest of the sizes of the pattern. So in this case, you need to cut 2 4-inch strips to make the pillow. You need to cut 7 4-inch strips to make the throw. And you need to cut 26 4-inch strips in order to make the bed-sized quilt. Okay? The next chart is going to show us how to then take those strips and cut them into smaller pieces. This is the step that may be presented in a quilt pattern as a chart, as I've done, or maybe written out as directions. Here, because we only have 2 fabrics, I was able to include both the fabric color and the size down that left-hand side of the chart, and then put the different sizes of project across the top. If I had more fabrics, I would put the different colors down the left, so 1, 2, 3, 4, however many. The sizes across the top, 4 by 4, 7 1/4 by 7 1/4, etc. And then I would use that same parenthetical notation inside the cells to indicate how many for each size of project. Okay. Here, like I said, we've got 2 sets of information going down the left-hand side because we don't have any overlapping sizes between the 2 fabrics. And we can see that from those 2 4-inch by width of fabric strips, we're going to need to cut 4 by 4 squares, okay? And it goes on down. Now that we've made it through our cutting, oh, one more note on cutting. I mentioned that you may also see this written out as written directions in kind of list form. So in that case, it might say from 1 4-inch by width of fabric strip cut, colon, and then in bullet points underneath, it would tell you what to cut out of those strips. All right. This is really common if you're cutting just a few of a bunch of different sizes out of a width of fabric strip. Now, once we've got our fabrics chosen and the yardage or pre-cuts, we've cut all of that into different pieces. It is time to put our quilt together. And your next step in your quilt pattern is going to be assembly. First, you will assemble the units of your quilt. Then you will assemble the blocks if it's a block-based quilt, and then you'll put those blocks together into a quilt top. Here, you can see some of the graphics for assembling 4 at a time flying geese. Personally, I think that once the cutting is done, the hardest part of the quilt pattern is behind you, because these next pieces are things that often repeat themselves from pattern to pattern, right? I have several different patterns that all include flying geese, and the graphics and directions look very, very similar from pattern to pattern. So once you've made a set of 4 at a time flying geese with me, or honestly just about any designer, chances are it's going to feel pretty familiar once you get to the assembly step. That being said, on this page, there are going to be written instructions and diagrams to make it as easy as possible for you to get through these steps. And it's not uncommon for designers to also include a URL or a QR code pointing to their website or social media channels where you can actually watch a video tutorial of how these different steps work, especially if there's something a little bit funky going on with the pattern for some reason. Once you have those units put together, you will likely see a diagram for how to put the blocks together. Or if it's not a block-based quilt, there'll be a diagram of how to put the different parts and pieces together to make your quilt top. And then down here at the bottom, I've included a quick note about how to lay out those blocks in order to make the quilt top. This is very straightforward. It's simply laid out in a grid. So I was able to have very abbreviated directions for that here. The last pieces that you may see inside of a quilt pattern are going to be kind of the fun and pretty bits, right? There may be photos or diagrams or mock-ups of the quilt in different colors or fabrics, and you may see a coloring page like this to help you choose your colors and fabrics. Lots of designers, myself included, also use tools like Precut or Quilt Ink to be able to allow you to digitally color your patterns before you actually commit to choosing those fabrics. If the designer that you're working from their pattern uses a tool like that, there's likely going to be a reference from it on a page like this inside the pattern to point you to that digital resource to make it as easy as possible. There you have it, folks. We have gone through the lovely Sawtooth Star quilt pattern. We've talked about the different sections and the types of information that you're going to see, as well as how to interpret it. If you are new to quilting, new to reading quilt patterns, or just find it to be a little bit challenging to make it through some of your favorites, I hope that this sheds light on the different parts and pieces, how to utilize them, and how to go step by step to break down a bigger project into something much smaller and more manageable. Once again, don't forget to head to the caption of this video for a free link to this Sawtooth Star pattern. And while you're there, like, subscribe, and maybe leave a comment telling me your favorite part of this video. Thanks, y'all.